Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting jewishinsider.com. Joining us today is AJC CEO David Harris, one of the Jewish world's leading experts on global trends, who will take us around the world to discuss some of the key issues facing AJC and the Jewish community. Described by the late Israeli President Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, David Harris has led AJC since 1990. Moderating this conversation is AJC Chief of Staff and Chief Innovation Officer, Bel Yoeli. After we hear from David and Bel, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Bel, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jillian, and welcome again to all of our viewers from around the world. David, as always, it's great to be with you. As is usually the case, there's a lot happening in the world, and there's a lot that I'd like to ask you, David, so let's jump right in. But before moving to our global agenda, I have to ask you, David, a week ago today, you were honored, marking your 30th anniversary as AJC CEO. It was a wonderful event. What are a few high points and low points over the past 30 years? I know that's a long time span, but I have to ask you when it comes to standing up for world Jewry, Israel, and democratic values.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be back on Advocacy Anywhere, and thank you, Bel, for being my partner on this program. Yes, I've been in this job for 30 years, and I've been involved in Jewish advocacy since 1975, so a total of 45 years. And I've learned a thing or two along the way. I would say the single most important positive thing I've learned is to delete the word impossible from our vocabulary. What may have seemed impossible at a certain moment in time has proved possible on many occasions. And time permitting, and we don't have the time, I could offer you countless examples. For me, among the most obvious examples, certainly in my experience, has been the Soviet Jewry struggle. When I took this position in 1990, there was still a country called the Soviet Union. It was still a communist regime, though Gorbachev had tried to reform it. And there were still millions of Jews living in the Soviet Union. But 30 years later, the former Soviet Union exists, the Soviet Union does not. The so-called satellite nations of the Soviet Union through Central and Eastern Europe are gone. Germany has been reunified. We're talking about Jewish communities that have reemerged on former Soviet soil throughout Central Europe, from the Baltics to the Balkans. Germany as arguably the fastest growing Jewish community in the world. And that's just one slice of things, Bel. I can look elsewhere in the world. In 1990, apartheid was still the prevailing system in South Africa. Today, apartheid is happily a rapidly receding memory. In 1990, Israel did not have a peace treaty with Jordan, much less with Bahrain and United Arab Emirates. So wherever I look, there has been positive change. On the other hand, and because being Jewish is always a little more complicated than one or the other, what I've also learned or been reminded of is that history is not linear. It's not that we go from good to better to best and then repeat the cycle from good to better to best with happy endings at all times. And I think the most stark reminder of how unlinear or nonlinear history is the trajectory of anti-Semitism. So here we would have liked to believe, especially after the Second World War, and with the extraordinary rebirth of the State of Israel, and the extraordinary success of the United States, and the fact that Jews throughout the world largely lived in liberal democratic societies, no longer in authoritarian or apartheid-driven societies, we would have liked to believe that anti-Semitism was vanishing. And yet here we are in 2020, and perhaps there'll be more time to talk about it, Belle. And not only has it not vanished, but it's resurfaced. And not just there, but here. So on the one hand, yes to the possibilities of change in history for the better. On the other hand, never lose sight of the fact that history can return, and sometimes with a vengeance.
Thank you, David. So let me pick up on that, on the more positive side of those thoughts, with the agreements you mentioned between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain, and beginning our tour in the Middle East. So about 1 month has passed since those accords. What are your thoughts 1 month later? What are the lessons learned? And perhaps you could also mention, are you optimistic about more steps or similar steps in the region and beyond?
Well, I'm a chronic optimist. So the moment someone says to me, "Are you optimistic?" In the long term, I am. I continue to be awed by these two agreements, normalization agreements with the UAE and Bahrain. I was privileged to be on the White House lawn on the 15th of September, representing the American Jewish Committee. And you had to be pretty cynical or thick-skinned or hard-nosed, Belle, not to be moved by what was happening. And the most striking thing was not just the fact of these two agreements, though that was obviously important, it was the warmth of these agreements. Having followed the Egyptian and Jordanian stories since 1979 with Egypt and 1994 with Jordan, they were hugely important. They were historic. But what was missing was not only the top-down element that existed, but the bottom-up element, the street, if you will. Here, it's the street. It's the response, especially in the UAE, the desire to engage with Israel on so many fronts. And just in the last month, Belle, there have been so many agreements, so many discussions between the UAE and Israel, universities, airlines, cultural groups, go down the list. It's an all-inclusive kind of relationship. So that for me is the takeaway. This is for real. The second takeaway is beware of the so-called experts. I don't wish to belittle people who've spent their whole life in academia or in policy, but there's a message in this story that we need to remember as well. The so-called experts, the university experts, the experts in Europe and elsewhere, in many of the diplomatic communities, insisted on telling us that the only way to achieve this kind of an agreement with the UAE or Bahrain or any other Arab country today was through the Palestinian Authority and through a deal with the Palestinians. And absent that, they kept insisting stubbornly, steadfastly, that nothing could happen. Not to pick on him in particular, I have respect for John Kerry, but in December of 2016, John Kerry was Secretary of State. He spoke at the Savant Forum in Washington, and he was asked this very question: could Israel move ahead with Arab states absent a Palestinian agreement? And he gave, we talk about the three no's of Khartoum in 1967, when the Arab world said no to negotiations, no to recognition, and no to peace with Israel. Well, John Kerry topped it. He gave 4 no's in his answer. It's all available. No, 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 and no. It cannot happen. Less than 4 years later, it did happen. Back to my earlier point about the impossibility of impossibility, and also to my other point, be wary of experts when their expertise turns into a kind of hubristic certitude that leaves out or excludes other possibilities. Whatever one may think of this administration and the American Jewish Committee is fiercely nonpartisan, a lot of credit has to be given to them for seeing the possibility of changing the paradigm changing the negotiating concept and moving ahead with Bahrain and the UAE.
Thank you, David. So speaking of experts, there's another topic staying in the region that comes to mind where experts and analyzing behavior, what will happen or won't happen, come into play, and that's Iran. And in just the next, I believe, 4 days, the arms embargo against Iran will end and it will expire. How did we get to this point? And obviously, AJC has been very engaged on many issues relating to Iran. What happens next, and where do we go from here?
So yes, AJC has been very involved in Iran, and given the fact that I began my own advocacy in 1975, and that was 4 years before the Shah was ousted from leadership in Tehran and replaced by Khamenei and the religious clergy. I've watched Iran for now 40 years. And in terms of AJC, Bell, we have been strongly advocating on Iran for several decades. How did we get to this point? That in 4 days, literally in 4 days, today is October the 14th, in 4 days on October the 18th, which is, I believe, this Sunday, Iran will legally, I stress, legally be able to buy and sell weapons, conventional weapons, without violating any laws or even violating the JCPOA, which was the Iranian nuclear deal, which was announced on July 14th, 2015 by the European powers, the United States, China, Russia, and of course, Iran itself. And under the terms of that deal, this is the expiration date. And by the way, this is the first of several expiration dates that will be coming in the next several years, which reminds us how quickly time flies. So when the negotiators of the deal thought they were buying time, well, yes, they bought time. But when you're not looking, time flies. 5 years are over and done with. Now, who's happy about this? Well, I can tell you that China is very happy about this. Russia is very happy about this. Those two countries have absolutely no hesitation or compunction about selling weapons to Iran now openly and legally, as opposed to clandestinely. Who else is happy? I would have to guess North Korea is deliriously happy. Venezuela, Turkey. These actors all have relations with Iran. Many have had clandestine or under the table relations with Iran, but some of those relations can now come out into the open because there is nothing illegal in what they're doing. So I think that's a huge part of the problem, and the United States has taken a firm position in opposition to the embargo's end. So has Israel, no surprise, but so have the Sunni Arab countries, the countries that are closest to Iran and that probably know Iranian behavior best. Now, one has to ask, how do we get into this situation, and why did the negotiators 5 years ago think that 5 years later, this could happen and we could all sleep well at night? And having spoken to many of those negotiators, often in very small settings, very quiet settings, I think the principal mindset that I took away was the belief of a number of them, including in Washington, I must say, that this deal would ultimately strengthen the so-called moderate faction in Tehran. They saw Iranian politics as a kind of spectrum where not everyone was lumped together sort of, in a pyramid, but more horizontally with centers of power, and that the so-called reformers would be strengthened by the Iranian nuclear deal, and ultimately power would gravitate more in their direction. So what I took away from those meetings in Washington and in Europe and elsewhere was 5 years, 10 years, the Iranian regime will change. I don't mean revolutionize, but it will moderate. It will turn more inward. It will focus more on domestic development, on the need for social and economic reform. I believe then, by the way, and I said it then, and I believe today that that was a fundamental misreading of the nature of the Iranian regime. It is a revolutionary regime. It's driven by a clear ideology. It's not just a survivalist regime that wants to get along. It has an expansionist view of its place in the world as the leader of Shia Islam. And it's not by accident that we speak about Iran today in Yemen, Iran in Iraq, Iran in Syria, Iran in Lebanon, Iran in Gaza, Iran trying to establish itself in the West Bank. And we also see Iranian tentacles, either directly or through its proxy Hezbollah, in Africa, in Asia, certainly in Europe, and with attempts here in the United States as well. So again, I think it was a well-intentioned but ultimately dangerous misreading of the nature of the Iranian regime that got us to this perilous moment 4 days before the arms embargo ends.
Thank you for that explanation, David. And obviously, I know we'll be watching closely to see how this plays out in the coming days.
We have no choice.
Absolutely. And since you mentioned Hezbollah, I wanted to mention, obviously, Guatemala, for those who don't know, just became the latest country to list Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. And this is the latest country to join a growing number of European, Latin American, and other nations that are taking this action. But the EU itself notably does not recognize Hezbollah in its entirety. David, can you refresh for those who might not know what the issue is with this distinction? Why is this still not moving forward in the European Union, and how AJC is approaching this issue?
Absolutely. Again, this is an issue, Bell, like Iran, where we at AJC have been at it now. We can measure it not in years, but in decades, literally. Because ever since the 1980s, and actually this month, October, in 1983 was the occasion when over 300 American and French peacekeepers in Lebanon were murdered in Hezbollah attacks. So the Hezbollah story is not new, but 37 years ago was a turning point. Or fast forward to 1992 and 1994 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. First, the attack on the Israeli embassy, 29 people killed. 2 years later, the attack on the Amia building, if you will, the JCC or Federation building of the Jewish community, 85 people killed, 300 wounded, and keep going to the present. So this is not a new story. And the good news in the story, as you mentioned, is that Guatemala has now become the 5th Latin American country. It joins Honduras, Colombia, Paraguay, and Argentina to list and ban Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, period, full stop. They also joined a number of European countries that began with the Netherlands, was then joined by the United Kingdom, was then joined this year by Germany and Lithuania within the EU, and outside the EU by Serbia and Kosovo. And notably in the Middle East, Bell, obviously Israel has always treated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, but strikingly, so has the 6-member Gulf Cooperation Council. And so has the Arab League, which voted to recognize Hezbollah as a terror organization. But to your question, the anomaly in this whole story is the European Union itself, that is the 27-member EU body. And only in 2013, and only very reluctantly, over, I must say, French resistance, I want to repeat, French resistance, the EU created this artifice, this artificial bifurcation of Hezbollah into a so-called military wing and a terror wing. And the then 28, because the UK was still part, the then 28 labeled the military wing a terror organization, but not the political wing. Again, as I said, this was completely artificial. It was artificial because Hezbollah itself said, and others knew, it's one unitary, indivisible organization. no more than we could divide the Nazi Party or ISIS or Al Qaeda into a military wing and a political wing. What were the consequences of that? Well, the consequences were that anything designated military in Europe was banned, but anything designated political, meaning, for example, support for widows and orphans, was considered legal. Now, anyone knows that money is fungible just as politics is fungible. So if one holds an event for Hezbollah in a European city and flies the Hezbollah flag and says we're raising money to address the medical and health needs or the pension needs or the food needs or the vocational needs of our brothers and sisters in Lebanon, technically that's fine. That's fine. In reality, of course, Hezbollah trampled on this distinction. It mocked this distinction, publicly mocked this distinction. But France in particular believed and seemingly still believes that it has a special historic understanding of Lebanon and neighboring Syria for reasons that go back into to the French colonial past, and that this needs to be finessed. And the French argument is often expressed as Lebanon is a fragile state. Hezbollah is a part of Lebanon, a part of its political structure, and to ban Hezbollah is to endanger the very stability of Lebanon. By the way, our argument, Bell, has been exactly the opposite. Lebanon will never be a stable, secure state as long as Hezbollah is allowed to operate both as a political party, meaning running for seats in the parliament, and at the very same time as a state within a state that has its own, I won't even call it militia, because that would diminish it, its own army, with an arsenal, we're told, of well over, please listen carefully, well over 100,000 rockets and missiles, including precision-guided missiles courtesy of Iran, all of which are pointed at Israel, and most of which are hidden or buried in civilian population centers, including mosques, hospitals, schools, and private homes. As long as Hezbollah seeks Israel's annihilation, and as long as Israel will not allow that annihilation, Lebanon itself becomes vulnerable. It's being used by Hezbollah. So the notion that avoiding the truth about Hezbollah somehow preserves the stability of Lebanon flips the truth on its head. As long as Hezbollah exists inside Lebanon, it will never be a secure and safe state because it seeks the destruction of Israel. And by the way, thousands of Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon spent years in Syria committing war crimes for the Assad regime in putting down the brutal civil war. And I won't speak about Hezbollah operatives elsewhere, including on European soil, the same Europe that continues to live with this fiction.
Thank you, David. And I think just for our audience, as a bit of a teaser, you'll see some upcoming further AJC campaigns and initiatives specifically on this issue. So I'll ask you to keep your eyes out for that. Moving to another interesting, and I'll actually say troublesome actor, I have to ask you about Turkey, which seems to be in the news a lot lately. And I think some might say for all of the wrong reasons. So can you explain to us, David, what's going on with Turkey and how does this affect your work and AJC's global work at this time?
So you want me to talk Turkey? I'll talk Turkey. Let's dial back for a moment, a century, just for a brief moment, to a man named Kemal Atatürk, whom I'm sure many of the viewers know or recall, had a vision for modern Turkey, the Turkey that emerged from the end of the Ottoman Empire. And that vision included a Western, secular, modernized Turkey. And he took some extraordinarily important and I would say far-reaching steps to advance that that vision, including, by the way, the separation of religion and state, which was really quite a revolutionary decision for a Muslim majority country at the time. So fast forward from that, let's call it Ataturkian vision of Turkey to where we are now. In 2003, the current president, Erdogan, became prime minister of Turkey for the first time, or late 2002, early 2003, so 17, 18 years ago. And he's ruled ever since, either as prime minister or as president, but today unquestionably as the ruler of Turkey, the ruler of Turkey. And he brought with him a very different vision. It was not the Ataturkian vision. He may have invoked it from time to time when needed, when convenient, when politically expedient. But his vision was a different vision, and you see it playing out now. It had a vision which some might call a neo-Ottoman vision, a kind of restoration of Turkey's sort of historic greatness and projected outward. So even as Turkey developed as a nation, its reach, its influence would grow. And ultimately, it might even become the leader of the Muslim world. And we at AJC first met with then Prime Minister Erdogan in 2003. And I can tell you, as the veteran of literally, at this stage of my life, literally thousands of diplomatic meetings with world leaders, it was one of the chilliest, iciest, most concerning meetings I have ever attended. 90 minutes took place in Ankara in the Prime Minister's large conference room. There was an American Jewish Committee delegation in the room. And when the meeting was over, we went to a nearby coffee shop. I think there were about 10 of us, and we sat, and I asked each of our delegates, what did you think of the meeting? And to a person, each of the people, none of whom had met Erdogan before, said, this is not our friend. And that was a message we carried back to Washington. It was then the Bush administration. It was a message we repeated during the Obama administration, and a message we've continued to repeat during the Trump administration, and a message, by the way, we brought elsewhere as well. Turkey is way too important, Bell, to simply kind of sideline. Our message was not that. It's way too important. Just look at its geography, look at its size. It punches above its weight. But nonetheless, our message was, be careful in your reading of Turkey. Don't misread Turkey. It's no longer the Ataturkian Turkey that you might have thought it was. Look deeper into what Erdogan is actually doing, not just what he's saying and what he's saying for Western audiences. Look at what he's actually doing. And what do we see today as a result of that neo-Ottoman sort of thought process? We see Turkey in lots of places, Bill, playing very unhelpful, unconstructive roles. Though a NATO member, they have purchased S-400 surface-to-air missiles from Russia. NATO is apoplectic about this because Turkey also is the home to a major Western air base. And Turkey was also in line to receive the F-35. So just imagine for a moment, the same country would have the F-35, our most advanced fighter aircraft, and the S-400, the Russian-designed system to shoot down the F-35. Now, in the same country, meaning that the engineers and the technicians could go back and forth between the two, and who knows, share what secrets with whom. Pretty obvious, I think. Turkey has flexed its muscles with one other NATO country, Greece. Violations of Greek air rights, overflights by the Turkish Air Force, and both with Greece and Cyprus, entry into the maritime waters of both countries. In the case of Cyprus, violating the exclusive economic zone of Cyprus, sending Turkish ships to drill for energy sources in Cypriot maritime waters, sending ships, seismic ships, doing geological ships, I should say, to do studies in Cypriot waters. Now Turkey going beyond even Greece and Cyprus as far as Libya and getting involved in a very complex civil war there, but choosing sides there. Many have, Turkey's not alone, but then drawing a new map of the Mediterranean and the maritime zones as if Greece and Cyprus do not exist, as if the maritime border in the Mediterranean is between Libya and Turkey. So the island of Crete, for example, has kind of vanished from this map. So Turkey is flexing its muscles in lots of ways. It's flexing its muscles in Europe. I mean, ask the Netherlands, ask France, ask Germany, ask Austria. As Erdogan, seeing large Turkish communities in these countries, immigrant communities, tries to retain their loyalty to Turkey, even at the same time that these host countries are trying to encourage the integration of these communities. Erdogan, to say the least, is not being helpful. In effect, what Erdogan is trying to achieve is these communities in Europe which retain an allegiance to Erdogan. To Turkey, of course, immigrants retain an allegiance to their homeland. That's understandable in many cases. The language, the family, the food, the history, the experience, that's understandable. But this is to Erdogan's political agenda. And he has a political agenda in Europe, as he does in the Eastern Mediterranean, as he does in North Africa. And the last thing I would say is, and Turkey was once upon a time a strategic partner of the State of Israel. Turkey has become a very outspoken antagonist to Israel, not to this or that policy, but to Israel. It has aligned more often than not with Iran. It has hosted Hamas. It has done everything possible to undermine Israel and now to undermine the normalization agreements with the UAE and Bahrain. So how the West deals with Turkey, stop pretending that Turkey is what it was and start coming to grips with the fact that Turkey is something different. Even as it's easy for me to say because I'm not in the decision-making process in government. It's much easier to give advice from outside than inside when you have to deal with the consequences of your decision. Turkey is complicated. It's big. It's strong. It has many important borders. But simply showing weakness to Turkey or internal division in Europe toward Turkey will not contain Turkish behavior. It will only, I fear, encourage it.
Thank you, David. I want to turn to the United States and a couple of global trends. But briefly, I have to ask you, since you mentioned Greece and staying in the region, there was some good news recently. Golden Dawn, the neo-fascist party, its leaders were convicted of essentially running a criminal organization. Some of its members were found guilty of acts of violence. And actually today, I believe the leader was sentenced to the maximum sentence of 13 years in prison. I know Golden Dawn has actually also threatened you personally. So can you comment briefly on the significance of this decision?
Well, yes, I have to dial back for a moment because I'm not sure all our viewers know or recall. Golden Dawn is a neo-Nazi party that surfaced, roughly speaking, a decade ago and started getting, as a political party, 6, 7, 8% of the vote, which allowed it to go into parliament. What made this particularly striking was not just that they were a neo-Nazi party, bad enough, Dainu, it would have been enough, but a neo-Nazi party in a country which was absolutely ravaged and devastated by the Nazis during the Second World War. There are a few countries in Europe that were as destroyed. And I'm not just speaking about the devastation of the Greek Jewish community, particularly in Thessaloniki, where 96% of the Jews were deported and murdered. I believe 10% of the entire Greek population was killed as a result of the Nazi occupation. The infrastructure of the country was destroyed. Hunger was rampant. And the resistance movement in Greece was among the strongest in Europe. In fact, I think at one point, one of my heroes, Winston Churchill, famously said, "Greeks don't fight like heroes. Heroes fight like Greeks." So it's that country in particular where you see a neo-Nazi party emerging and getting some resonance, some political resonance, 6-8%, way too much that allowed them to cross the threshold and enter parliament. But then the Greek leadership kind of confronted them. I want to give a special shout out to Prime Minister Antonis Samaras, who was the prime minister who took them on in the courts, to Nikos Dendias, who was then the Minister of Public Security and who is today the Minister of Foreign Affairs. They took them on, and their successors continued the effort to take them on, to take them into court, and to declare that this really was a criminal enterprise. And justice sometimes flows slowly, but justice was served. And just a few weeks ago, the Greek courts declared Golden Dawn a criminal organization. And then, as you said, Belle, just today, they sentenced its leader to 13 years in prison. We, the American Jewish Committee, were attacked by Golden Dawn. I personally was attacked. Several of our visits to Greece had to be with very heavy security, armed security, the inability to leave our hotel without armed security. There were threats to us. And there was one particular cartoon, which I can't show here, in 2013, which kind of captured it, with Golden Dawn putting me in kind of a throne-like seat with the Greek prime minister at the time, Antonis Samaras, at my knees as if to do my bidding, with sort of Jewish blood depicted in the story. And behind me, an ugly, bigoted, racist picture of Barack Obama in the crudest image, kind of looking on, as if he and the Greek prime minister were puppets of the Jews represented by the American Jewish Committee, and in this case, by its CEO, me. So I couldn't be happier. I couldn't be more admiring of those Greek officials. And by the way, the Greek Jewish community, small but tough and determined, who helped ensure that justice would be done by saying it's unacceptable that in our democratic country, the birthplace of democracy, and one of the most affected victims of Nazi Germany and its allies, a neo-Nazi party could actually exist, much less flourish on Greek soil. So there is some good news. And again, the impossible is not impossible.
Thank you, David. Moving now towards the United States. Just in case anybody forgot, there is a national election happening in less than 3 weeks. And of course, AJC is a strictly nonpartisan organization, but I have to ask, how do you see the role of the United States moving forward? And of course, that could depend on the administration, but kind of where you are in your analysis, your thinking in terms of what our role on the global stage looks like ahead.
Right. So, yes, I've taken notice that there is an election on November 3rd, as I'm sure all of our viewers have too. I mean, for me, globally, if we're speaking now from the global perspective, and then perhaps we'll move domestically, but globally, for AJC, central to the answer to your question, Belle, is we need America as an engaged, enlightened, important, I dare say, powerful force on the global stage. That's our starting point. Let me clarify for those who read too much into what I just said. It does not mean, in our view at least, America everywhere at all times, or America kind of ruling in a Pax Americana. It does not mean American troops everywhere, but it does mean something, I think, simpler, but I hope obvious. An America in which a world in which America is not present and is not seen as a leader, is a world that loses its navigational skills, that creates vacuums. And just as in physics, so in politics, where there's a vacuum, someone will fill it. And we know in today's world Those who will fill the vacuums created by an American retreat or withdrawal or decline in power may not necessarily be to our liking. And I go a step further, will be enemies of liberal democracy. At the end of the day, for us, for AJC, I'd like to think for us as Americans, more generally, liberal democracy, and I don't mean liberal in the sense of liberal versus conservative. I mean liberal as opposed to illiberal or authoritarian democracy. After all, East Germany, in its official German name, was called the German Democratic Republic. DDR were the initials in German. North Korea, the official name of North Korea is the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So people can claim the word democratic. I'm talking about democratic in the sense of liberal democratic values as we know them: democracy, rule of law, smooth transfers of power, vibrant civil society, protected civil rights, basic human rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In that world, America has been the leader. And when America doesn't lead, look at American isolationism in the 1930s. Look what happened. We had to come back in 1941. But without America, there is no global leader of the liberal democratic community. So whether Donald Trump is reelected for a second term, whether Joe Biden is elected for a first term, but of course, we know Joe Biden from his decades in Washington, including his vice presidency, we, AJC, will be advocating for either administration for the exact same set of values. America must be present. America must be engaged. America must lead, and America must exemplify the values we defend. That's the America that we will be pushing on November 4th and 5th and 6th, and for the next 4 years, and I dare say for the next 40 years and beyond.
Thank you, David. And since you mentioned, obviously, more domestic issues, let me ask you what's on your mind specifically in that regard. And perhaps, obviously, we're a Jewish organization.
What's on my mind is protecting our 501c3 nonpartisan status between now and November the 3rd.
Absolutely. So let me ask you more specifically, in terms of the Jewish vote. Obviously, there have been certain trends over the past, many decades and years in terms of the Jewish vote in the United States. What do you see unfolding from a strictly nonpartisan standpoint? What is your analysis of what might happen in the Jewish vote in the United States?
So again, as backdrop, I believe that modern polling began on or about 1932, which would have been FDR's first run for office as president. And from 1932 until 2016, we have the data on presidential elections and the Jewish vote. More accurate, less accurate, of course, over time, presumably things got more accurate. But I can say that the Jewish vote has followed a pattern with a couple of exceptions. So the lowest Jewish vote for a Democratic presidential candidate, the lowest Jewish vote, was in 1980. It was the only time when the Democratic candidate, in that case, Jimmy Carter running for re-election, did not get a majority of the Jewish vote. Well, he got, if I recall, between 44 and 45% of the vote. In every other instance, the Democratic candidate won the majority of the Jewish vote. And again, if I remember correctly, the Jewish vote went as high as roughly 88, 89% for the Democratic candidate. I believe that was in 1992 when Bill Clinton challenged George H.W. Bush, who was running for re-election. So now let's flip it. The highest Republican vote in any of those presidential races was obviously in 1980, and that was Ronald Reagan, who got between 39 and 40% of the Jewish vote. By the way, for historical fans, there was a third-party candidate in 1980. I'll leave it to you to remember who that was or to look it up. And that person got, I think, between 12 and 14 percentage of the vote, which is why the numbers otherwise wouldn't add up. And again, the downside of the Republicans, 1992, where George H.W. Bush got, I believe, somewhere in the low teens, 12, 13%. So if you're looking at, let's call it elasticity, the range of the Democratic vote by Jews goes from a low of 45 to a high of 88, maybe was even topped in the FDR years, maybe as high as 89, 90. And for the Republicans, the elasticity goes from a low of, let's say, 12, 13% to a high of 40%. That's the backdrop in which we have to look at this election. And now we have some data. And the data comes from Pew, which is considered a very reputable polling firm. I just saw it this morning, so I'm lucky to be able to reference it for your question. And if I recall correctly, the Pew study predicts that that Joe Biden will get in the low 70s, low to mid 70s among American Jews, and Donald Trump will get in the low to mid 20s among American Jews. So that's the best data we have as of now, and that's Pew. We, AJC, will be providing additional data as we do every 4 years on the election, the issues that inform the election, and sort of the surrounding questions. Let me add one more interesting data point, Belle, which you didn't ask but is relevant, because there have also been polls among Israelis regarding the American election. Now, obviously, Israelis don't vote in American elections unless they have an American passport. But what's interesting is that it was almost a reverse image. The majority of Israelis, according to this survey, if they could vote in the American election, would vote for Donald Trump. And only a minority would vote for Joe Biden. What explains this? Which again, I know goes beyond the question, but I think is of interest, certainly is of interest to us at AJC, and helps explain the complexity of the Israel diaspora relation today. Many Israelis say that the first motivation for their voting decision is how the candidate deals with Israel. By the way, no surprise. I have no doubt that if the same survey were done in Poland or in Japan, and Polish or Japanese were asked to explain why they expressed a preference for one over the other, they would say, because we believe this one or that one is more favorable to Poland or Japan. And the majority of Israelis appear to be quite happy, maybe very happy with the Trump administration and how it's handled US-Israel relations. So since they put that issue first, and they may be less concerned with the other issues that inform American Jewish voting, economic policy, tax policy, race relations, the environment, Supreme Court nominations, I think you have this wide discrepancy. Among American Jews, again, we know from AJC surveys and others, Israel is a factor, but it's one of a number of factors. The other factors I just mentioned are no less important to American Jewish voters. In this case, Supreme Court nominations, or public safety, or race relations, or economic policy, or tax policy, or healthcare, or environmental policy. So American Jews are saying to themselves, when I put all those together, roughly 3/4 are saying, I trust Joe Biden more than I trust Donald Trump. Whereas Israeli Jews are saying, for me, the single most important issue in the American elections is how the next president handles ties with Jerusalem. And we've known Donald Trump for 4 years. We like what we see, the transfer of the embassy, the recognition of Golan, the Abraham Accords, the voting at the UN. So we'd like to stay with what we have. We know Joe Biden, he's fine, but from our perspective, Donald Trump has shown more. That's my analysis. I'm still sticking to the 50-yard line, and please, no one try to read into anything I said, any partiality on the part of AJC or myself. This is analysis and only analysis.
Thank you, David, for sharing your analysis. I'm realizing that I've abused my time as the moderator, so we only have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna, no, it's mine.
It's not your fault. I've given long answers to your short questions.
I'm looking at the audience questions, and I'm gonna try to combine a few because we only have a few minutes. There are a bunch of questions about, zooming out more broadly about Facebook's recent announcement banning Holocaust denial and distortion posts, and kind of more broadly, what that says about the current state of anti-Semitism and in the United States and perhaps around the world. So as a seasoned a veteran of the cause and the fight against anti-Semitism throughout your career, can you comment on that decision and perhaps AJC's involvement or insight on that decision, and what you think of the current state, how optimistic or pessimistic you are about the current state of anti-Semitism, whether online or more broadly? I know that's a big question, but that's combining a few.
And we have, 20 seconds left. The Facebook decision, which was announced on Monday, so just 2 days ago, was, to our mind, a very important decision. We applaud Facebook for making the decision. And we also appreciate the fact that in Facebook's statement, which was issued on Monday morning, they cited two, as they described them, global Jewish organizations that had worked closely with Facebook to help them achieve this decision to ban all Holocaust denial and distortion from Facebook, which again, given the reach and the size of Facebook, is enormously important. And the American Jewish Committee and the World Jewish Congress were the two organizations that were cited as these two global partners of Facebook. And we were very proud of our own role in working not against Facebook, but with Facebook to try and help them understand why this was no longer about freedom of speech, why Holocaust deniers and distorters were peddling anti-Semitism, raw, naked anti-Semitism, and trying to use the pretext or excuse of the protection of free speech to stir up yet another, if you will, generation of anti-Semitism. And I especially wish to applaud Mark Zuckerberg, because earlier he had famously said, and I'm paraphrasing him, that as a Jew, all of this was repugnant to him. And yet he felt that Facebook had an obligation as a kind of public square to allow even views that were repugnant to him to be heard. And he clearly turned around. And again, I'm happy that AJC was one of those key players that quietly and constructively tried to sort of change the conversation. Now, Bell, the question becomes, will others do the same? I mean, after all, Facebook is not just, another kid on the block. Facebook is the 800-pound player. Will others do the same? Because the fact of the matter is that while anti-Semitism has never disappeared, it waxes and it wanes, but it never disappears. The availability of the power of social media, of sort of this digital world in which we live, has just exponentially expanded the reach and the impact, if you will, of the voices of anti-Semitism, whether they are jihadist voices of anti-Semitism, whether they are white supremacist, fascist, neo-Nazi voices of anti-Semitism, or whether they are anti-Zionist voices of anti-Semitism that uniquely among all the world's nations would only deny one nation its very right to exist. And that happens to be the one Jewish majority nation. So what I'm saying is two things. One, we hope that other social media companies will follow the example of Facebook, where they haven't. And we at the American Jewish Committee are eager to work with others quietly and constructively. And the other thing I'm saying is, this is an important step, but there's more, because the anti-Semites are endlessly inventive. So if they can't sort of directly tackle the fact that Auschwitz never existed, they will say, or Dachau never existed, though they so obviously did, they'll reemerge and they'll come up with new constructs, and they'll sort of work their way around the Facebook restrictions, and then we'll have to deal with it in a different way. So the challenge of grappling with anti-Semitism in social media has not ended with the Facebook announcement on Monday, but it sure as heck has taken a very important step forward.
Thank you, David. And for our last very few moments, again, my attempt to combine a few questions. Clearly, a lot of our viewers are concerned about whether it's the uncertainty around the pandemic or heightened levels of tension and polarization in this country and around the world, for that matter, kind of how we meet this moment. And for those who care about the issues that we've discussed, anti-Semitism, U.S. global leadership, Israel's place in the world, what's your advice to those who care about these issues, who are engaged with AJC's work, when we're facing so many challenges at the same time in this moment?
I think we'd have to start a second hour of conversation, Belle, to do that really important question, any sense of justice. So what I will say will be telegraphic. By the way, an ancient word, because many people in today's world have no idea what a telegraph even is. But that's when you send messages and you paid per word. So you were really consolidated. 280 characters in Twitter seemed like an essay compared to a telegram. We need leadership. We need enlightened, responsible, forward-looking, serious leadership. And as I look around the world, and I'm speaking about the liberal democratic world, I see in many places an absence of that kind of leadership, number one. Number two, we need a reaffirmation of what unites us as liberal democratic societies. Let's start in America. We speak again and again about division and polarization. If at night I channel surf and I watch, for example, say Chris Cuomo or Rachel Maddow, and then I watch, say, Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity, I'm not just watching different channels. I'm watching different depictions of the world and the country in which we live. We are so far apart as a nation. And as someone who believes in America, whatever its imperfections might be, and Lord knows they've been revealed to us again in recent months, Belle, this remains a unique country. And I fear that if the centrifugal forces that are pulling us apart and leading us into our respective camps, in opposing camps, in confrontational camps, in separate political and ideological and communications bubbles, America will suffer. So we need leaders who lead responsibly, and we need leaders and citizens, residents, who understand the imperative of uniting, of reestablishing the glue. Sure, we'll have our differences. I'm not against differences. I understand differences. I value differences as a key element of democracy. But those two things, leadership in liberal democratic countries and a sense of responsibility that at the end of the day, we have one destiny, not multiple destinies. And let's find not only what divides us, but try and find the steps needed to restore a measure of civility and a recognition that in a democratic society, compromise is one important element. If each of us insists on a maximalist position, democracy won't work. The beauty of democracy is we hold on to our positions, but at the end of the day, we understand that the perfect may at times be the enemy of the good. We need to work as one and not as two countries within one country.
Thank you so much, David. I think that's an important note to end on. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you as always for your thoughts, your analysis, and your candor. And with that, I will turn it back to Jillian to close us out.
Thank you, Belle.
Thank you so much, Belle and David, as always. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation to AJC by visiting ajc.org/donate. Thank you and goodbye.